Hello and welcome. I'm Garima, and joining me on the Dais today is Geoffrey Cann. Former partner with one of the big four consulting firms, he has over 30 years of experience advising the oil and gas, energy, and technology firms. Over 3 decades, most of Mr. Cann's work has been at the intersection of a business problem and a technology solution. We are absolutely delighted to have you with us, sir, today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely, sir. And sir, let me first begin with your journey in this industry. It's been 30 years. And when we talk about the digital space, the industry looks up to you. How has it been for you? What inspired you? What motivated you to come to this industry?
Well, it's an interesting story, actually. I first, after graduating from university, joined an oil company in Canada called Imperial Oil. Mm-hmm. Imperial Oil is a subsidiary of ExxonMobil, so a very large oil company. Mm-hmm. And eventually I transitioned to consulting and was living and working in Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. But my travels took me extensively throughout China. Mm-hmm. And one day I'm in a northern town in China called Baicheng. Mm-hmm. Baicheng stands for, its translation name into English means White City. Okay. And Baicheng is so far north that it's called White City because it snows there all year, a lot of the year, and it's very cold. And so I arrive in this town, 2 million people, it's a city. And the hotel had no front doors. Mm-hmm. You just walked up from the street and you went to the reception desk.
That's very interesting.
In the wintertime. And the young woman behind the desk was all bundled up in winter clothes because it's so cold. Mm-hmm. And I took photographs of out on the street. And how China got its energy at that time was by donkey cart. Donkey carts were delivering lumps of coal door to door so that people could heat their homes. Mm-hmm. And at night, the coal fires created this very, very dense fog. And it was so polluted, it was hard to breathe. And you couldn't see where you were going at night in the dark. There's no streetlights. Mm-hmm. And it was at that time that I said to my wife, I came back to Hong Kong, that half the world's population gets its energy by donkey carts, delivering coal door to door. Yeah. Whereas in North America, we just flick a light switch and we have energy.
Yes.
And I said, the world needs energy. Half the world gets its energy this way. This is where I'm going to devote my career. My work forever will be in helping the world get energy, deliver energy, consume energy, use it responsibly and sustainably. So that's how I got into this whole world.
That's very interesting. And so when you entered into this space of consulting and advising other companies, what particular challenges did you witness at that point of time when you started?
Well, back then, the computers literally had just been invented. So in my university days, I purchased a new desktop computer. And it was $2,500 Canadian, so quite expensive. Mm-hmm. So the wave of change that we now see is very, very typical. Laptop computers, tablets, phones, those things basically didn't exist. The internet didn't exist. When we were producing documents for clients, we would go to the typing pool, and there would be a group of people whose job was to type the reports up for us. And so I have to think back to that time, no spreadsheets, mathematics was done on calculators. You used printed tables to do calculations. You weren't able to do complex math. Graphics were very, very simple. There's no PowerPoint. Like these tools didn't exist back then. And so the challenges were, how do you carry out research and study and solve problems with these older style tools? And so it was very much a paper and pencil and calculator exercise. I still have my old calculator, which I got in university, and I still use it. But it's an old HP.
Yes.
I mean, this is how the world solved its problems back then, was on this 30-year-old calculator. So the challenges back then were related to things like the sophistication of your analysis was limited because of the amount of data that you could collect and how quickly you could crunch it. Your scenarios you looked at were limited because you just didn't have time to be able to go. Now the scenarios you can consider are into the thousands before you have to actually make a decision. So it's a very, very different consulting world that we're in now than we were then.
We have definitely come a long way.
Indeed.
Yes, sir. And sir, talking about your book, Bits, Bytes, and Barrels, what inspired you to pen down this extensive book? And it's getting some amazing reviews on Amazon as well, and from people who have read it. It's on my list as well. So tell me about your inspiration.
Well, at the time I started to think about the book, I was working in Australia, and I was living in Brisbane and concentrating on the liquefied natural gas industry. And at that time, I was surprised at how sophisticated Australia was relative to Canada. I'm a Canadian, and at the time was before going to Australia, I was in Calgary working in the oil and gas industry. And I thought Canada was a sophisticated country when it came to its use of technologies, including digital. But Australia was further ahead, much further ahead. Banking, retail, telecommunications, entertainment, media, financial services, all much further ahead, except oil and gas. Oil and gas in Australia was exactly the same as it was in Canada. And in part, this was because Australia had imported a number of international people to help build their new liquefied natural gas industry, including Canadians, Americans, Brits, and what those international people did was bring their practices with them from other countries. And what this meant was that Australia's gas industry was going to look and feel very much like the rest of the world's oil and gas industry.
Yes.
And it was at that point that I said, this wave of change, which just hit industry after industry after industry, has to get to oil and gas eventually. And it was, to me, it was with all of the young people carrying smartphones with them, in their pockets, their iPhones, and they were doing everything on their iPhone, except when they went into the oil and gas world, they would go back to what tools that they were using before. And I said that gap has to close at some point.
Right.
And that's when I started to think about, well, what is the future of oil and gas? How will digital affect this industry? What will it look like when it gets here? Which companies and industries would win? Which ones would lose? What are the skills people need for the future? All of these sorts of things were swirling around, and I was thinking about them. And that's what came together ultimately as this book.
Right, sir. And if we talk about 2020 particularly, where do you think the industry is in its phase of digitalization? As we mentioned, as you mentioned, the phase had to arrive in the oil and gas industry as well. It had to touch the industry. Where do you see the industry at the current moment?
So a few facts that people need to really think about or keep in mind. The oil and gas industry is principally what I call a brownfield industry. In other words, most of the oil and gas infrastructure that's in place today, which is producing and delivering energy safely and reliably anywhere in the world, predates the digital era. In many cases, it predates the internet.
Right.
So we have technologies which are very, very mature, very, very solid and reliable. They work, but they are dated in terms of their capabilities relative to what we're now all used to through the internet era. And these technologies don't change very quickly. It's very hard to change brownfield infrastructure. So the current state of the industry is mostly driven by decisions taken long ago to deliver energy in a certain fashion using the technologies available in the day at that time. You have to think about an offshore platform.
Yeah.
If you put in enough conduit in an offshore platform, conduit is like piping, so that and you can thread wires through the conduit so that you can deliver a communication service around your platform. You can't pull that platform to shore and add new conduit. It's just not how you do it. It's too expensive. And if that brownfield infrastructure was never built for the internet era, it's going to be very, very challenging for it to embrace digital change.
Right.
And so the current state of the industry is this mix of brownfield equipment, which cannot easily change and will not easily change, and greenfield newer areas, which are becoming very sophisticated in their use of digital technologies. And so we're on a journey as we kind of work our way through it. Some parts of the industry can change very, very quickly and can embrace very quickly. Right. A mobile workforce, for instance, can work with digital tools very quickly, but the physical assets that are actually running cannot. And so we'll have this mix of for a very, very long time of parts of the industry which can change very rapidly and be very different and very novel and creative, and then parts of the industry which will be forever feel like they're stuck in the 1960s or the 1970s.
And so if we talk about the present times, some of the digital trends which you would say need to be watched out for, what would those be?
Well, if you really come to mind, I'll just give you three that really stand out. One is what I call the signature ways of doing business. If you think about it as a company, it's your special way by which you get stuff done. Digital tools are creating the ability for companies to transform or create new ways of doing business in very, very clever ways. And these bring together a combination of the data that a specific company or process works with, the Internet of Things, which is creating that data, artificial intelligence and machine learning tools which interpret that data, and robots or autonomous solutions that execute the data and now do real work. So the first area of opportunity, the first major change that industry can take advantage of is to think about the signature way of doing business. The second major change is for digital innovations to actually take off and deliver tremendous value. They need to be in the cloud. And so embracing cloud computing is a second critical platform that the oil and gas industry needs to do in order to get ahead and be different in the future. And the third major area of change is around ways of working. The digital industry works in a different way. It moves much faster. It uses techniques called Agile and Scrum and other techniques that create faster rates and waves of change. And oil and gas can adopt many of these same practices in their industry in different ways of doing work. And so those are the three things that I see that the oil and gas industry can be concentrating on to move its agenda forward. First is thinking about its ways of business, its signature ways of business. Second is to embrace these platform tools like cloud. And third is to think differently about how work gets done so that the pace of change can speed up.
Right, sir. And do you see any particular challenges? What challenges do you perceive in these major steps?
Well, the first problem I've already touched on, but much oil and gas infrastructure is brownfield, and it doesn't change very well. Right. And so the key is to do and embrace these changes anytime there's something new. So if a company were, and it's hard to imagine today's oil price, but if a company was investing in a new piece of technology or piece of equipment to carry out work, the first question they should be thinking about is, how do I bring this greenfield technology into my brownfield business? Do I make it behave like all of the other brownfield equipment? Or do I embrace newer ways of doing business with this new piece of equipment? That, to my mind, is the first question companies have to ask themselves. And because right now the barrier to change is the attitude or the view that something greenfield and new should actually work exactly the same the brownfield works.
Right.
And what this does, of course, is it stops change in its tracks when that attitude is there. So that's the first thing that I would have companies do is embrace, look at the greenfield, and change their view, the standard response, which is to make it behave like everything else.
Right.
If you like, the saying you hear about is paving the cow path. Instead of making a straight road and straightening out the process, we'll often take the windy, broken process that does not very efficient, and we'll make it efficient by making it very digital. But it's still a cow path. It still wanders around. It's not very efficient.
Right, sir.
That's the kind of challenge that the industry has to ask and answer itself, which is how do we take these innovations and not fall prey to the temptation to make them behave like the old ways of doing business.
And so, which actually brings me to my next question, that we often say, and even other technology leaders mention this, that technology is the easy part. But when it comes to the cultural change and the change management, that is where the real challenge lies. So
exactly.
Yes.
Yep, completely agree. This is in the end of the day, there's a distinction between buying digital and being digital.
Right.
But buying digital is I just buy technologies and I put them into my business and hopefully I get a benefit. Being digital, though, means changing culture, attitudes, and ways of working so that the companies are behaving in a different fashion. And it's far harder to be digital than it is to buy digital.
Right. Absolutely, sir.
Far harder.
Yes. And sir, there's this very interesting concept that you talked about in one of your recent articles, which was gamification in oil and gas.
In oil and gas, yeah.
Yes. Please help us understand this concept and how it is impacting the industry.
Well, gamification tools, we are all very familiar with them in our non-oil world. Right. So if you went even on LinkedIn, you have a like button and a share and a comment. These are tools that the digital industry uses to create human engagement with their solutions and their platforms. When you're the author of a post on LinkedIn and you get a comment on your post, it creates a little reaction in the human body. It's a little release of a chemical called dopamine. And the dopamine is it's a pleasure chemical. It makes you feel good about yourself, and it makes you feel good that someone is paying attention to you. And this is so the game platforms put all kinds of these little techniques into their platforms to promote engagement with their tool. And the social tools like LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube all do the same thing. It's curious to me that we don't do this in oil and gas systems. Why is that? If you have imagine you're a large oil company and you have 300 data sets, critical data sets that people in your company regularly use. Everything from your accounts payable register to the subsurface data for a specific reservoir to the performance of your vendors and suppliers in delivery of their goods and services. Right. Why do we not have like buttons, share buttons, and comment buttons on those data sets so that the ones which are the greatest value appear faster or attract more attention in your company? Okay, yes. Why do we not do that? And
again, again, an attitude problem.
Well, we don't think about it. If you're in the engineering world, and many of my friends are engineers, and so I hesitate to I don't want to be too critical of them, but for the most part, they spend more time worrying about the physical asset and how it's going to behave, and much less time about the people who are going to interact with that asset. And where Silicon Valley has changed is they've actually devote far more attention to thinking about how humans will interact with things, right, and much less about the thing itself.
Right.
And you can see this in platforms like Airbnb. I don't know if Airbnb can you use
Yes,
Airbnb in India?
yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
So Airbnb produces a handful of points for the house. If you wish to rent a room in your house, they'll tell you it should be clean. it should you should have a coffee machine for your guests because visitors like coffee. You should have towels and clean linens for your guests. So they give you these pointers and guidelines, but they don't tell you how to arrange your furniture.
Right.
And then they devote all of their energy onto the online platform itself.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in oil and gas, we would devote all of our energies into specifying very clearly exactly where the bed should be and what the linens need to be made of and how frequently they should be cleaned. All of the energy into the room and almost nothing onto how you interact with to find that property or that site. And this is the major shift that has to happen in the oil and gas industry around gamification tools. Like you have to think much, about how do people are they going to interact with your technology, and then embrace different ways to create that engagement level that drives the attention and the consumption and the use and the engagement.
Right, sir. And this is so interesting, actually. And with the millennials coming in, with the great crew change that is happening, do you think this would be pushed and accelerated more and faster? We might have this in times to come.
It depends. The challenge with oil and gas is that the decision makers who are allocating capital and deciding what direction to go, for the most part, are themselves quite distant from digital technologies.
Right.
And so they don't often weigh these criteria about incoming generation and talent considerations as highly as they do around other elements associated with oil and gas, such as safety and reliability and performance and so on. Don't get me wrong; those are important, but if the industry does not create a place, a context where young people will find careers that are consistent with both their social purpose in life, in addition to at least matching what they experience in their other outside of work life, engaging with social tools, then talent is unlikely to stick around and spend a career inside oil and gas. And so the talent problem is potentially a significant concern. But, back to, one of your earlier questions was, what is the state of the industry? And the industry has not yet come to terms with this reality, which is the talent may not show up wanting to work in oil and gas in the future. Certainly in Western economies, that would be the case.
Right. That's true, sir. And so now talking about your experience, going by your experience, you have been through so many oil market cycles, and you even talked about the cycle being so personal. And help us understand that, take us down to the very, very first downturn that you experienced, and how would you relate that to the present crisis that we have before us?
So the first crisis that I remember when I was working in the industry was when I was with Imperial Oil. And at that time, the price of oil fell dramatically. At the time, it's kind of laughable, but the price was very high, $30 a barrel, which wasn't high at all in retrospect. But it fell down to $10 a barrel. Okay. And the issue at the time was that OPEC, the oil producing nations, were able to produce 60 million barrels of oil per day. That was the productive capacity of the industry. But the demand was only 40 million barrels per day. So there's a huge gap between what the industry was able to produce at low cost versus what the market was prepared to buy or consume. Right. And so this caused a decade-long price slump. Right? A decade, a very, very long time before the demand slowly rose to work its way through to where it finally met and became in balance with the 60 million barrels per day of supply. Right. And so why it gets personal is that when you're in the industry and you're a young person or a young engineer, you're a senior engineer, it doesn't matter. When the industry has a standard playbook, when the down cycle comes into the industry, and when the price starts to go down, the industry reacts very, very quickly to protect the longevity of the company. And so they will cancel capital projects that they don't need to execute. They will go to all their suppliers and ask them for a price relief, price discount.
Right.
They will let go of their employees who are surplus.
Right.
They will move offices, get out of high expensive rent areas and go into low rent areas. They'll trim their dividend. And eventually they will, and sometimes they cut salaries, and everybody takes a pay cut just to survive. So so it gets very personal very quickly in this industry, where your job is at risk and so on. And as an individual, when you're in it, you feel quite powerless, because it's you didn't do anything. It wasn't like you're a bad person or a bad employee. The demand goes, it just disappears. And so it gets very, very personal very quickly. And in my case, I was in Toronto working for Imperial Oil. I was 2 weeks away from a transfer to Calgary, another part of Imperial Oil's business. 2 weeks away. Everything was lined up. Relocate, move, everything was all set up. And they came and they said, not moving, not going to do it. And so, I had at the time I was married, and my wife and I had agreed this is what we would do. And, she was ready to quit her job. And so it gets very personal. You have to make life decisions when the industry turns, unfortunately. That's just the way it is.
It is.
Now, how it's different from, so you'd ask the other question, how is it different this time? So this time, the gap between supply and demand is not nearly so big. Right? It's not nearly so big. It's not 60-40. It's not 60 million barrels production, 40 million barrels of consumption. The situation's different. This time, and for the last 10 years, as the industry has grown, because it grows about 1.5 million barrels of demand per year, per day, per year. The American shale revolution has taken most of the growth in the industry. In fact, the American shale basin has grown faster than the Russians and OPEC combined. Okay, this is pretty shocking when you think about it, as I characterize it. Expensive, complex oil from the United States, financed by the public capital markets, low interest rates, has taken market share from simple oil, which is not so complicated to produce, from Russia and OPEC, and by companies that are state-sponsored. I mean, this isn't sustainable.
Right.
And eventually the Russians and OPEC said, we're not going to support this any longer, and so they flooded the market with oil. Now, how the gap between supply and demand normally wouldn't be so bad, except they did it at the exact same time as the pandemic. The demand has fallen by 20 to 30 million barrels per day through March and April. So you have this surge of oil coming into the industry at the same time as the demand has fallen dramatically, and it's all gone into storage. And now we have to figure out how to take it out of storage and get it into the market. And that takes months and months to unlock all of that locked oil and gas.
Right.
So that's how it's different this time. Now, how it will repair itself is hard to forecast, but that's how it's different.
And sir, if I talk about how are you looking at COVID-19 and its impact on the industry, do you see a silver lining here? What are the opportunities that you see amidst all the chaos that we have before us?
Well, the first thing that is clear, and oil executives now get this, which is it is possible to run an oil industry without employees having to congregate in a single office tower every day.
Right.
That's a major shock to the oil industry, because they wouldn't have believed that. If you'd said to any oil executive in December of last year, in January, no one will come to the office anymore. They'll all work from home. Most executives would have said that's just not going to happen. They're going to be working in the office on February, just as they did in December. And yet, here we are, not in the office. the business model, which has oil and gas workers in close proximity all of the time, is now a threat. That's a problem. It's not a solution. That's a problem.
True.
And so this is a real signal to the industry that for the oil, so setting aside the demand question, because the exact same problems we're talking about in oil exist in retail and entertainment. People can't get together. So the oil industry now recognizes that digital is the tool that has been saving them since the pandemic started, because of things like Zoom and collaboration and so on.
Right.
And they're going to have to do more of this, not less of this, in the future. And so that's been a major shift in thinking about the industry. If we did not have the pandemic and we just have the oil price collapse, I don't think the oil industry would have changed very much. You just wait.
Right.
And the problem fixes itself. But with the pandemic, this is not the case. It actually has changed businesses and will change them for at least the next 18 months.
Right. And so since we're talking about the changes in the traditional ways of working and the traditional conventional models that we have, how has your personal work life changed during this time?
Well, it's changed hugely. So my business had basically two parts. Part one was what I call an active business. I run training courses in person for companies in oil and gas who want to get smarter on digital. What does it mean? Why is it important to me? How do I embrace it? And all of that in-person training is gone. Like it doesn't exist any longer. The second thing I was doing was public speaking. I take my book to conferences and I speak about the ideas behind it, and I try and encourage oil and gas companies to embrace digital. That's gone. So there's no conferences. So my entire active business just evaporated. The other side of what I was doing is selling books. Obviously, my book is in the marketplace, and online training. And so the online training has gone like this. The demand to get workers smarter on digital has never been stronger, as the oil industry now knows that digital is one of the things that's saving it. So therefore, they have to pay much more attention to it. So the demand on the digital side's gone up. I haven't traveled since February. Normally, I'm on an airplane every other week, going someplace.
Yeah.
So that's completely gone. I would always design my own business to be completely paperless, and so that's just carried on the way it was. And I do a lot more meetings like this with that are done virtually and on Zoom. That's been a major change. Yeah. So and then related to that, any business activity that I do, which normally would be go to a supplier of some kind to get something, all gone. It's all done by delivery now. It's all the supply chain's gone online. So it's a huge change for me, for sure.
Right. And so when, as you said, the conferences, now the industry might want to shift a lot of events online. How do you see that? Do you see that happening? We have conferences like SERA Week, ADIPEC, OTC. How do you see that evolving with this time?
Well, the first thing that will happen is that the smaller conferences, this is events with 100 to 200 people, will first start to happen. It looks like they will be largely confined to in-country attendance. And this, of course, is a problem for oil and gas, because one of the reasons why oil and gas is a global business. Like, the oil does not respect global boundaries at all. Right. Oil goes to the market. Right. So the first challenge is how, with smaller conferences and smaller meetings being permitted, 50 person, 100 person, how do you get the international content injected into those meetings? That's going to have to come through forums like this.
Right. Right.
Like, I could quite easily do a presentation to a large audience in India over Zoom.
Yes, definitely.
It's not impossible. It's easy to do, but it's a behavior shift. Companies have to be ready to do that. And then that that's going to happen first. And then next is the larger conferences of 1,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
These aren't trade shows at this stage. These are just conferences. So will start to take place within regions. So Australia, New Zealand, maybe parts of Southeast Asia, Singapore, Hong Kong area, Middle East might be another where that'll be permitted. And then the really large conferences, which are 25,000 people, 50,000 people, those are going to be pushed off for at least a couple of years, because we need to completely rethink venues, hotels, air, because they're all international.
Right.
Air travel has to come back. Hotels have to come back. Ground transportation has to come back. Those are going to take a long time before they return.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so since you are in this space, you are an expert in this space, when we talk about cost and productivity savings, why do you think pushing digital at this point of time is actually the right time? We needed maybe a crisis like this to help people understand the relevance of digital. So how do you see that?
Well, the evidence of the companies that have embraced digital in oil and gas is very, very clear. There's a capturable, realizable benefit on cost alone to justify most digital investments. On productivity, productivity is trickier to get at, because it generally means embracing more change to be able to extract a greater productivity from an asset or a process. But both productivity and cost are capturable by digital. And so the question is, why do it? Why do it now? Well, the reason for now is that the pandemic is going to be with us for at least on and off for months, until either we get global herd immunity or we get a vaccine.
Right.
And, hope is not a strategy. You can't hope that a vaccine will show up. And even today, employees are saying to their employer, I don't want to get in a truck and drive for 3 hours with someone I don't know and run the risk of getting this virus and then bringing it back home. And so changing the business model so that you take that proximity question away, and so people are not exposed to that. That's a today item. It's not a delay. If you wait, the problem doesn't solve itself just by waiting. It's going to be with us until we get to the vaccine or the herd immunity. And just since oil is an international product, international business, it's very, very tied to travel. So Canadians travel to Southeast Asia. People in the Middle East go to the North Sea. Brits come down into the Gulf of Mexico. So oil is inherently global, which means all of those different countries all have to be at the same level of pandemic response and capability. So we manage the transmission of the disease across international boundaries. And, that's not something that is going to happen overnight, but the oil industry will continue to run. And so the timing couldn't be more important for this industry to embrace change. Like delaying is not a strategy. It's not going to solve anything by delay. In fact, delay makes things worse. Hence so I say the timing for making change right now is very, very good.
Absolutely, sir. And along with digitalization, how important do you think is collaboration across the industry, especially during this time?
Yeah, so the pandemic, as an example, the oil and gas industry does not compete on safety, right? This is a standard practice in industry. The industry does not compete on safety. In other words, if I've learned something that improves my safety performance, and I'm an oil company, I have a strong obligation to tell everyone in the industry about that, so that the whole of industry stays safe together. This is really, really critical. The industry does not compete on safety. And therefore, the industry will not and should not compete on pandemic response. If one company in the industry has discovered a way to manage down the pandemic effect in its business, to keep it safe, to keep its employees safe, they will communicate that to other companies in the industry. So collaboration on pandemic-related matters actually is going up in this time. It has to. Otherwise, the industry will run the risk that the virus will just go from company to company to company because the industry is so highly interrelated. So the timing and the response, I think, for collaboration is very strong there. Where it's also strong is in the supply chain. So in the same way that, imagine you're an oil company and I'm a supplier to you as an oil company. You and I would typically, if we were having a meeting, I would come to your office and I would see you and spend time with you there. We can't do that now. So now we have to find other ways to collaborate. How are we doing it? Zoom meetings, Slack channels, Microsoft Teams, Amazon Cloud Services, shared platforms in the cloud. That's how we're now embracing collaboration with the supply chain in oil and gas during the pandemic, so that we eliminate the proximity problem, people getting too close to each other for disease transmission, but at the same time continue to solve the problems of the industry.
Absolutely.
So collaboration through digital is really, really key.
And we are also witnessing this amazing spirit of solidarity, as we have been discussing, that people will be coming closer online, maybe, because obviously we cannot connect the way we used to connect earlier. So
that's right.
That is happening. And
very much.
Yes. And so moving on to the post-COVID world, what do you think would be some of the business models that we will see coming up post the crisis?
Yeah, this is very, very hard to project as to what those business models are going to be. But a few do really, you can start to see the early signs of them. And in fact, I would say those newer business models were already in place. Pandemic just gives them a boost, and they'll move faster. A good example is the use of edge computing or artificial intelligence-based tools that do things like optimize and run fields. In North America, there are technologies that a combination of machine learning and device controllers that can optimize well performance. So we have a technology which is called a beam pump, and it looks like a rocking horse, but it's like the slow moving arm goes up and down, and what it's doing is it's slowly putting pressure into the well, which forces the oil to the surface. That beam pump, it's very susceptible to variations in the subsurface. So if it's water, then the beam pump is lifting water to the surface. Well, who wants water? We don't want oil. So, but sometimes the oil isn't there and the beam pump is doing work and there's no oil, which is a drain on the motor. It burns carbon unnecessarily and increases wear and tear on the equipment. So there are companies now in North America that will attach an edge controller to that device with its own Unix operating system and a machine learning algorithm that optimizes every single stroke automatically at the edge, almost like a robot. So that every stroke is perfect. There's no waste. It doesn't pump up water. It doesn't pump when there's no oil to pump up. It pumps faster when there's lots of oil so that you get economic returns, and it slows down when there's nothing to pump. And it does this automatically. In oil and gas, this is kind of like creating a robotic or automated workforce that is supervising all of those wells and making them all optimal. This is a radical shift in how oil and gas thinks, because today, all of these oil wells, once you set them up and the beam pump starts working, it just goes. It doesn't react at all to what's underground. And then it burns out. Now you have to send a crew to go and fix it. But if you could actually optimize it so that that defect doesn't happen, you improve your throughput, you reduce your carbon, you don't have the maintenance costs and so forth. This is a fundamentally new business model for this industry, because it takes a huge amount of costs out and makes these marginal wells, which are, the ones you have to do this work on, they can become much more economic. That's just one example, but there's lots and lots of examples of this automation and automated business models that are changing quite dramatically how oil production is done. And that's just in the upstream. We haven't talked about midstream, downstream, refineries. Here's one from refineries. Today, when you run an oil refinery, you have what's called a linear program, which is the calculations to tell you how to configure the refinery plant to process a specific kind of crude with the least amount of energy, the greatest amount of throughput, the lowest amount of waste, to yield the perfect amount of product for what you need. So much diesel, so much jet fuel, so forth. Well, we don't have jet fuel demand right now because there's no airplanes flying.
Traveling, yes.
Yeah, it doesn't happen. So how do you now run your linear program? Well, you might, in the classic ways, you run the LP once a day because it's very compute intense and just runs. Well, what if you put that LP in the cloud and you ran it with Amazon or Microsoft? Now you can run it constantly. Thousands and thousands and thousands of variations. And that's a fundamental shift in thinking about an oil refinery. It's not I have to run it once for a crude. You could actually run the LP for every single barrel if you wanted, and constantly tuning it and adjusting it. That is a very, very different way to run a refinery than our current model.
True.
And so that's just coming about. We still haven't figured out, well, how does that change how you value refineries, how they operate, how they perform? But that's an example of where digital is unlocking creative new ways to think about even the refining sector.
And so since we're talking about automation in the oil and gas industry, where do you think are the areas, what are some of the areas where there is no match to human intelligence? How do we take care of that? Not everything can be automated, maybe.
Yeah, not everything can be automated and not everything should be automated. And so where there is where humans have a significant advantage over computers is taking advantage of those unique human characteristics that computers cannot replicate yet. And that's things like creativity and problem solving and empathy and teamwork and leadership. So those roles and jobs are just never going to go away. They're always going to have them. And so that's where humans need to play their role, which is where we have to do things like pull teams of people together to solve problems in a hurry. This is not something you let a machine do. That's
Right.
where humans do. Will you have a machine tell you, open up a new plant somewhere? Probably not. That'll be a human job. Will you have a machine tell you, you should shut this plant down? Well, it might give you guidance about shutting the plant down. It might say, hey, economically, the margin you're gaining from this facility is now trending below your economics. But it would be a human who would say, yeah, but if we shut the plant down, we would throw all of these people out of work. They're very, very scarce. We can't easily recruit them back. And it's very hard on our brand in our community when we do that. We need to maintain that employment level. So humans will play that role, which is making the decisions and so on. But decisions that are very routine and regular, mathematical, like that beam pump. Every time that stroke of that beam pump is done, there's a mathematical calculation that says how fast should that beam pump operate. Today, a human will do that calculation once and let the beam pump go. The human could do the same thing in the future, make a decision. There just aren't enough humans to go around, though, to do that job. So that job is going to go to automation.
Right.
The decision to put that computer on that beam pump, though, is going to stay with a human.
Absolutely, sir. And so moving on to the online presence and digital presence of oil and gas companies. If we look at the oil and gas industry, it has been traditional in many aspects, in many areas of life. And one of them is building an online brand presence, an online social media presence, for example. So how important do you feel it is to have an online presence today when it comes to oil and gas companies, small businesses, large companies, and in between?
Well, it's very important. I mean, if you went to a young person today and said, how do you find something, right? They'd say, well, you go online. That's how you find anything now. When I went to Australia, my wife and I was my first career, my wife said, "How will anybody find you in Australia?" And I said, "Oh, it's simple. They'll just go online and look me up." And she said, "Have you tried to look for yourself online?" And I said, "No, I actually haven't tried that. Maybe we should try that." So we sat down on the couch and typed in my name into the computer and went looking for me as a contact point. And we had to get to page 6 on Google before my name popped up. And people aren't going to go to page 6.
Yes.
They're only going to go to the top 5 on a Google search. So the message was very clear. I would not be successful personally in Australia if I didn't make it easy for people to find me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's that alone is should be sufficient driver for companies working in the industry. It doesn't matter what you do or who you are, unless you are famous already. Beyonce, right? Mr. Modi, your prime minister, Donald Trump. Unless you're one of those characters where people know who you are, you need to figure out how can people more easily find me. And the only way practical these days now is to do that through a digital presence online.
Very true, sir. And now, sir, let's talk about your podcast, Digital Oil and Gas, and tell us about it all. And tell us, why did you choose podcasting as a platform, and how has it been for you so far?
So this is the second podcast I've built and turned on. The first one was in Australia with when I was working in the liquefied natural gas area. And what I learned was that people who read and visit websites online are not the same people who watch videos and are more visual learners, and they're not the same as people who listen to podcasts. There's actually these 3 different audiences, right? We consume by reading, we consume by watching videos, and we consume with our ears. And what I discovered was that if you want to build a bigger audience for people to listen to you, you have to appeal to all 3. You can't just do one. So the podcast came about because of that reality that if you have 1,000 followers on your blog site, there's another 1,000 who could listen but are not, because you don't have a podcast. So that's why I turned the podcast on, was to capture a different audience. The podcast has broadly 3 types of content. The first content is I'll take an article that I've written on my blog, and I will simply record that as a small narrated story. Okay. So it takes about 10 minutes to kind of listen to. Very convenient if you're on the train or in the, it used to be driving to work. Yes. The second is I'll do an interview with individuals who are either technology entrepreneurs or oil industry professionals to talk about the realities of the industry. And the third piece of content is when I do a presentation, I'll often record my remarks and then reproduce that as a podcast. And so those are the three types of content. I'm toying with a fourth one, which is to turn on a panel conversation or a panel discussion. And then I just run that on a regular basis. But finding other individuals who want to do this with me is a bit of a challenge. Yes. Unless you're in this, you're on this performance, unless you do this for a living, like it feels very odd that you would agree to do something like this. But anyway, I'm still working on that. So that's the story behind the podcast. It is available on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, in North America, a service called iHeartRadio. It's on Google Podcasts and on YouTube. Okay. And so you just have to search for digital oil and gas, and it typically pops up on your list. Yes,
sir, absolutely. And now let's talk about your journey. What milestones are you particularly proud of, and what are you looking forward to?
Well, in my own personal career, looking back, obviously a succeeding as a partner in one of the large professional services firms for 20 years is a huge personal milestone. The turnover rate in that industry is 15% per year. Mm-hmm. And so to last there for 20 years is just a very, very significant accomplishment. So that's one thing I'm very, very pleased about. I also Probably, I think, looking back, I was in 8 different offices in 30 years. So every 3 or 4 years, I would change offices and try something different. And my counsel to anybody who's following me in the professional services industry is that every 3 to 4 years, you need to change your career somehow in that model, because otherwise you're getting stale. And with 15% turnover, after 4 years, 80% of the people you started with are gone. And so they're all off on a new career. What are you doing? So you have to change it up. So that's the second thing that I would look back on is the every 3 or 4 years I would force my career to change to react to the current setting that I was in, which included, in my case, postings in Australia, Hong Kong, St. John, New Brunswick, Calgary, and so on. Third thing that I'm very pleased about, obviously, is getting a book published. There's millions and millions of books. Like, publishing a book's not a tremendous accomplishment when you think about it. But to get a book to the market, you have to write 200 words a day for 2 years to get it to a point where it's publishable. And that's a significant, if you're an Olympic athlete, that's, kind of like what you have to do to go to the Olympics. You have to devote a significant amount of your personal time in addition to your day-to-day to get to a point where you can achieve that.
Definitely.
And so that's a third thing I'm very, very pleased about. And, looking back, the book is, I'm just working on a Russian language translation contract.
Okay.
So the book will be translated into another language. And hopefully it'll be picked up in Spanish and Arabic and other languages, so that it becomes more of a global work than just a North American product. But at the moment, it's just in the English language. It turns out India is one of the biggest markets for it. I have constant demand for it in India, which I find really fascinating. Yeah.
So yes, definitely, sir. And I wish you all the luck with your initiatives. And
thank you.
Sir, now one final message for the executives, leaders out there in the industry who are struggling with their businesses right now. What is your message for them?
I would say that something to think about. There are 2 laws of digital. And these 2 laws are Moore's Law and Metcalfe's Law. And so we all know what Moore's Law is. It's over time, things that are changing exponentially, they're doubling in capacity and halving in cost every 18 months. And Metcalfe's Law says that the value of a digital innovation is equal to the square of the number of network nodes or network components in it. Oil and gas does not pay any attention to these 2 laws. It's like they don't exist. We don't build businesses in oil and gas where we say 18 months from now, it's going to be half as expensive and twice as capable. We don't. It's not how we think about this industry. And we don't think about the industry in network terms. We don't say, well, this well will talk to this well. We don't do that. We say the well will talk to the SCADA system and a human operator will stare at the screen. Those 2 laws are changing fundamentally every other industry we deal with on Earth. And it's the oil and gas companies who are running the energy infrastructure side of the world, which now need to be thinking about how do these 2 laws impact their company in the industry, and which ones can they take advantage of? Because there's an opportunity to be a digital oil and gas company of the future, just by thinking carefully, how do I embrace these 2 laws in what I do? And so my advice to oil and gas executives is think about that. Think about these 2, the ways that the digital industry behaves, and how can you take advantage of this in the oil and gas industry. Nobody else is. There's a openness, a hole in the market. Like, name a single digital oil and gas company that says we are first and foremost a digital company that sells oil and gas. It don't exist. But you can find pizza companies who say we are first and foremost a digital company that sell pizza, or we are a digital company that happens to deliver packages.
True.
Where is the oil and gas company that says we are a digital company and we happen to be delivering molecules of carbon and hydrogen to people who want them?
Right. Yes.
There you go. That's my advice. Think about Moore and Metcalf and ask yourself, how do I become the digital leader in this industry? How do I become the one that's differentiated from my peers? Because I'm embracing digital in this fashion.
Definitely, sir. Thank you so much. And, sir, thank you so much for joining us today, sharing your personal journey, your experiences, and your journey with the industry, the initiatives you have taken. There are so many things to look forward to, so much to learn from you. And we all look up to you as an industry leader. There's no doubt about it. And I'm just so grateful that you took out time for this interview today. Thank you so much again for joining us.
It's been my pleasure, and thank you for extending the invitation to me.
Definitely, sir.